Good morning. Good morning, everyone. All right, well, welcome to day 2 of the Reparations, Repatriation, and Redress Symposium. I'm going to wait on my opening remarks and introduction of the panelists until after Cori Bazemore-James comes and gives the opening blessing and land acknowledgement. I do want to say that this is day 2 of our symposia, where we have 2 amazing panels. The first panel is on critical and comparative reparations, repatriation, and redress, followed by Q&A and extended discussion here. If discussion is so robust, we'll also move it into the atrium. And then the second panel, around 1:30, is going to be called The Case for Reparations. Throughout this whole day, I'm going to be trying to get some of the sort of thoughts and generativity from yesterday and embedding them into this discussion for today, so we continue to seed and make space for this kind of dialogue, but also thinking imaginatively about the kinds of projects we can help to seed. We're closing with a roundtable where we want everyone to participate. So stay if you can for the 4 o'clock roundtable. We haven't figured out if we're going to sort of do a little roundtable action up here or we're going to try to do it in the atrium. So stay tuned. But we're 4 o'clock, we're having the closing roundtable, and we would love to have you all stay for that, where we could share resources, hear concluding thoughts from our panelists, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, let me introduce or bring to the fore Cori Bazemore-James. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Cori Bazemore-James. My Lakota name is Turtle Earth Woman, and I greet you with a kind heart and a hearty handshake. Thank you all for coming again today. I'll start with a short prayer, and I apologize to my elders for speaking before you and praying. And so if you could please stand if you're able. Thank you for bringing us together today to have these important conversations and to hear these robust and important stories about colonization and slavery and all these past traumas that people of Minnesota have experienced, so that we can work towards healing and supporting one another. And please take care of everyone in our nation and our country who's struggling right now. There's so many people going through so many different struggles that we just ask that you support them and show them love and show us how to show them love and love to one another. And pray for everyone who has recently lost a loved one, that they've taken a good journey, and that you comfort those of us who are left behind. And please take care of everyone in the hospitals and the prisons and all the places that keep them from being able to be here and have conversations like this. And please let us have a good day of sharing and healing and idea generating and collaborating. And for those who have to travel to go home, please give them safe travels and send us all away with good thoughts and good feelings in our hearts, and keep this good work going. Thank you. It's kind of weird to say a prayer into a mic. Not used to that. Well, thank you for coming. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes on land acknowledgements. And I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. And this is not an official one by the university. This is just one that I wrote. The land we gather on today is the original homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations. We honor and respect the indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from and who are still connected to this territory. It is U of M's responsibility as a land-grant institution to own our part in their continued displacement, incorporate indigenous knowledge into our work, and establish meaningful reciprocal partnerships with indigenous communities. So what is a land acknowledgement? It's something that a lot of institutions are starting to do. A lot of people are still trying to understand what it is and why we do it, and what it should incorporate. And so I thought in my few minutes I have to speak today, I would kind of talk to that and share resources, because a lot of times when we learn about them, we recognize that we should do it, but we're not sure how or why or where and in what situations. But in my experience, land acknowledgements are usually a written or a spoken statement, and they should include these topics. The tribes, it should be recognized the tribes that have a spiritual connection to the land in which the institution sits, whether they're still present in this place or not. The history of their displacement, our commitment to serving Indigenous people, and having a humility or a gratefulness for our ability to be in this place and exist here. So I want to show you a few resources. This is one where if you don't know which tribes are on the land or from the land that you are, if you're in an institution in another place and you just kind of don't know where to start, this is a really good website. Some native cartographers made this, where you just put in where you are located and it'll show you on a map. Can someone give me a zip code that you want me to look up? 55084. Taylor Falls. Is that right? I'll zoom in there. And that's the people whose land that is. Give me another one outside of Minnesota. 44092. In Ohio? Okay. Woo, jump over there. Hope no one has motion sickness. The Haudenosaunee and the Potawatomi is the people of that area. So yeah, so this is a really cool website. I use it very often. So anytime I'm speaking anywhere that I can reference the people of that place, so you can see how it kind of shifts. So yeah, this is a good one. native-land.ca. And then I want to show you a video. This also has a really good guide in here for how to develop a land acknowledgement statement. And I'll show you this video that's more about why it's important to Indigenous people. I hope the sound works.
Before I begin this morning, I'd like to recognize the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land.
Wherever I go on God's green earth, I do the Lakota tradition of acknowledging the four directions, the land, and the people living there. Unchimaka, as I call Grandmother Earth, the land, I view her as a sacred, living entity, and that's the way we acknowledge it in, Lakota thought and philosophy.
As a Native person, I'm ready for any kind of confrontation that might come up, or I'm preparing myself to remind people of all those things that they forget about. I was at a meeting in Minneapolis, and the room was primarily non-Native people. I was in a non-Native organization, but this executive director got up and said, "Okay, we're gonna get started." So everybody, was sitting down and getting quiet. And she said, "I'd like to get started by acknowledging the Indigenous culture of Minnesota." And I was like, whoa. And it just made everything fall away a little bit from me. My guard went down. I was more relaxed, because by saying that, that means she understands something that is just you can't talk about, right? It just relaxed me as a minority, as a woman, and as a Native person. It just pulled away this layer that's always there. It was super cool.
We're at a time where non-Native cultures are understanding the traditions of Indigenous peoples for probably the first time in our histories. So when I go to New Zealand, the protocol is to acknowledge each other's ancestors and your mountains and your rivers. And that's such a beautiful tradition. When people are in that space and say, we acknowledge who you are, this land, where your people come from, they're saying we acknowledge a relationship, but we're also creating that relationship. This is a good thing.
The important thing would be that folks would then sit with that. Like, what does it mean that our settlement is occupying this space? And what responsibility do I have considering that legacy to these contemporary things, right? And how do I stop distancing myself from that? Ideally, that would be, for me, the impact that this has.
If you start acknowledging that the land that you're standing on and the space that you are in belong to people that are still here, like, makes so much more room for understanding of all these other issues. It's one of those little things that, like, if it could just tip a little bit, all the, like, dominoes that could fall from it, I think are important.
Now I'm like imagining it and like wanting to live in that, like the thing that I'm imagining, like, yeah, that's actually really beautiful.
It's just being a genuine human being, to acknowledge each other's histories, the good and the bad.
Did you want me to show that link again? I could hear all the note paper. There you go. Give you a second. I thought it was a really powerful video that shows multiple people's perspectives and experiences. They also have on this one this guide. So if you fill out this right here, they'll send you a guide on how to develop a land acknowledgement statement. There's several resources like this. There's a lot of Native people that are asking for us and our institutions to do these. So there's lots of great resources, but this is just one. Then I wanted to show you a couple example land acknowledgements. Here's one in Illinois, and if we know about this school, we know they have some making up to do. So theirs, I thought it was really good though. They talk about, there you go. They talk about what is a land acknowledgement. This is why we do it. This is our objective in doing it. The scope and why and where we would do that. This is the actual statement here. And they also have an optional other way of doing it, so it gives folks a few ways of thinking about it. And this part's really neat. They not only list the pronunciations, but they provide a soundbite. Let's see if we could.
Kaskaskia,
Yeah, I thought that was really neat. I'll play one more.
Peoria,
So a lot of times we don't even think to add the pronunciations written, and so it makes it harder to get folks to do it when they're afraid to pronounce something incorrectly. So providing all the access to that kind of resource is really good. And some folks here, I'm sure, maybe you don't work in a university, maybe you work for a nonprofit or some sort of association, and it might be a question of, well, how do we do that in that kind of setting? So I wanted to show you ACPA. It's an association that I'm a member of, and I'm their Indigenous advisor right now. So I wrote their statement for this year. This is a conference that takes place in a different city every year, so our next conference is in Boston. So we talk about what is a land acknowledgement, why do we do it? Because a lot of times when you start implementing land acknowledgements, you have a lot of resistance, and so it helps to provide that information. And then here's the land acknowledgement that's specific to the location that the conference will take place. And every speaker, every large group speaker and every individual conference session will have this land acknowledgement statement as in one of their first few slides. We have the pronunciations as well. And we also provide some information about those tribes because everyone coming from the conference is not from that area. So maybe they want to learn a little bit about the tribes that they're acknowledging and have a little more personal connection to them. And we, being the New England area, there's many, many tribes. So I wanted to make sure we're inclusive. So we added links so that they can learn about all the tribes in the area if they want to, as well as local Indigenous support organizations in case they want to know how they can support as well, or visit a support organization while they're in Boston. And this is a really powerful example. A friend of mine who works at UVic shared this with me. They have their land acknowledgement written here, but they also have a video of their land acknowledgement. They have one last fluent speaker of the language, so they have him in the video and the university president. I think that's really important that you have someone that's high up in the institution to really show that we care as an institution to create that buy-in, the lower level. And I'll go ahead and show this. I know I'm going a little over time, but it's just such a good video, and it's easy to do, I think. We could easily do this at many institutions.
Aishka siam chalaja kanan kunts anate chal lekwangan sapsam tango siam school out atla te si sapsam lekwangan tango nitla isla ksana sila ksana men di school out snaka na sila nitla was at ngana at chokngin at snaka na men nitla jasa he was at chitlam na men snas qualsimachtan aichasiam. Thank you for coming to Songhees Esquimalt land. University of Victoria is on the land of the Chuklingin and the Snaka. My grandfather was the chief of the Chuklingin people in Snaka. My father was also from here in the Chuklingin area. Thank you.
We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. UVic recognizes that the history of colonization and the associated attitudes and policies and indeed institutions have significantly changed Indigenous peoples' relationship with the land. And for many years, those same things served as barriers to Indigenous students, keeping them from accessing higher education. We're committed to redressing those historical and continuing barriers, and while there's still so much more to be done, today Indigenous students are enrolling in UVic programs and succeeding in ever-increasing numbers. As part of our commitment to reconciliation, we're working to build better and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities, new programs for students, and we're working to bring our university into better harmony with Indigenous cultures, beliefs, and ways of being. Indigenous people and communities are an important part of building our university for the future.
I thought that was a good example. It's really powerful. So yeah, that's not too hard to do, right? We could do that. We could put that on our website. So I just want to go through a quick few common questions, and I want to get your input as well and help me answer this question. especially the indigenous folks in the audience. Do you ever get this one? Well, there's no tribes in my area. I just came from the University of Georgia before I moved here, and this was a common one. How might you respond to this question? There's a reason for that. Acknowledging the history, why there are no longer tribes in the area. Anything else? Yes. We're always on indigenous land. Yes, there's often tribes in the area and they're just not aware of them. Yeah. Usually what I respond to that is, yes, we're always on indigenous land, and every land that we're on, there used to be a tribe here. So even if they're not located here anymore, there are 5 tribes in Georgia, they're all removed. They still belong to this land, so you still acknowledge those 5 tribes. How about where and how should we use a land acknowledgement? What do you think? Yep, beginning of every class and event. That's good. Where else? At football games. Yes, that's excellent. Yeah, up there.
I think it'd be great if they showed it for like freshman orientations. Not all these videos, this doesn't make it in that time.
Orientation. Yep. Whenever decisions about the land are being made. That's excellent. How about every syllabus? Like we have a mandatory diversity statement or a disability statement. What if we had just a short land acknowledgement statement? Government meetings? Absolutely. What if someone says, but I'm just one person, what can I do? How might you respond?
Get other people to join you.
Find allies, maybe, who will join you?
I think you have to work in your sphere first before you begin to get allies. So if I'm a professor, I can put it on my syllabus. I can speak up at faculty meetings. I can talk to my students, and then kind of widen your circle.
Exactly. Yeah, work in your sphere. Yeah. Excellent. Any other suggestions? I'm sorry, can you speak more to that? Okay. So like if you're a solo Native person on the campus, that's often where a lot of us are. We are often solos on our campus, and you're in a very vulnerable position, and it's hard to press for things like this when the administration doesn't understand the need. Yeah, I would say the same of working in your sphere. And some of my research, I've heard from people who work in Indigenous Student Affairs, their students are saying, it's great, you say it all the time and we appreciate it, but when a non-Native faculty says it, that really means something. Because they hear it from us all the time. And one last question. We created a land acknowledgement, are we done now? We checked off the box on the list. We did it. What comes next?
We saw Hubert's beautiful longhouse, so maybe a cultural space on campus.
Cultural space on campus. Yes, free tuition for Indigenous students. Other thoughts?
Required course on Indigenous history for all students.
Required courses on Indigenous history for students and staff, maybe? Faculty, administrators, Board of Regents. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of thinking about how we do our work in our institutions. How do we incorporate Indigenous voice in how we do the things that we do? And not just, let's put a thing here, let's do a thing there, done, let them do their work in their little realm on campus. But no, how do we incorporate that voice into all areas of campus? That's what I have. Thank you. Sorry I went over time.
Oh yes, everyone, file in, please. Thank you. There's plenty of seats down here. Okay, I want to invite our panelists to come up here and find a seat here. Opening remarks, and then I want to introduce the panelists and read their wonderful bios. Hi again, I'm Karen Ho. I'm director of the RIGS initiative that's hosting this symposium. RIGS stands for Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality. We could not have put forth this symposium without the sort of multiple efforts and commitments and work of multiple collaborations across and within and beyond the university. A few folks I'd like to thank are Sarah Cronquist, the RIGS programming coordinator. Sarah, that's a shout out to you in the atrium. Multiple graduate students and collaboratives that have really worked super hard for this. Rashad Williams, David Lemke, Ezekiel Zubert, Hana Maruyama, the Historical Injustices Working Group, especially Yuichi Onishi, the College of Liberal Arts, the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshop Grant, the Office of Public Engagement, the Institute for Advanced Study, and all the staff at the Institute for Advanced Study who are here working the tables and also in the audience, and Jennifer Gunn, who's the director, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the Institute, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, the Immigration History and Research Center, the Institute for Global Studies. I could go on, but you could read it down here, okay? I just wanted to make sure that I didn't forget, like I sort of did yesterday. So if you were, okay, anyway. So as I was saying before, what I really want to do, and I hope sort of, is to really generate conversation today, right? And so my opening remarks today are in that process of, again, really wanting us to continue the conversation. So thinking back to yesterday, right, I'm reminded of Rhonda Robinson Thomas' amazing presentation where she indexed that it wasn't so much about tearing down a monument, but rather to use the interpretation and the signage around the monument to embed the labors, the inequality, the work, the diversity, the violence, right? So that it's that sort of violence and the conditions of possibility aren't so much removed from it as they are continually acknowledged and sort of moved through. And so that was quite instructive. Balraj Gills also sort of emphasized that with what happens if we actually begin the story from the voices of enslaved folks from the sort of archives at Harvard University. What sort of important difference does that make? Marvin Anderson's presentation, where he talked about I-94 demolishing a central African American neighborhood in St. Paul. And he talked centrally that there was a so-called choice between the sort of northern route, which was the deindustrialized railroad that was at that time not as populated. And yet he sort of made the case it was never a question about population. It was a question about social engineering that was framed through a kind of anti-blackness, right? And the construction of the slum in the first place. So we don't construct the landlord. We do, but they're not marked. We construct the slum and catalyzing it through anti-blackness that it, in a sense, wasn't a choice, right? That became, or it was the obvious choice in a sense to bulldoze the neighborhood. Joey Mogul's work and presentation that talks about, in a sense, that the importance of the imaginative project when it comes to thinking about reparations, that it's about that sort of hope and speculative work, right? Precisely because reparations often die, the conversation about reparations and the work towards it often dies on the sort of models of pragmatism, right? That are, again, embedded in these sort of normative models. We had Kate Bean and Carly Badhart-Bull talking about the importance of the sort of the so-called small projects that actually index huge projects, right, and the ongoing work of restoration. Guy Emerson Mount challenged us to think about to what extent does the bigness of restorative and reparations projects need to index the large-scaledness of the violence in the first place. Rose Myron and Christine McCleave talked about the mass graves, in a sense, at these boarding schools, right, that index the extent of deracination. Kevin Whalen's story of overhearing non-Native discourses talking about the handouts to Native students because of the tuition waiver for Indigenous students at Morris reminds us that the origin story of reverse discrimination, right? The origin story of an equal playing field is even stronger today, one could argue, than ever before. And so how do we imagine reparations and reconciliation and repatriation in that context where the very social fabric and the assumption of the facts is that these violences have been solved? So hopefully we'll sort of we'll continue with thinking through and across these kinds of questions, and this is precisely what this panel seeks to do. So let me introduce our wonderful panelists. Dr. Brenda Child is Northrop Professor and Chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota and former Chair of the Department of American Indian Studies. She's the author of several books in American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, which won the North American Indian Prose Award. Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, Indian Subjects, Hemispheric Perspectives on the History of Indigenous Education. Her 2014 book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, won the American Indian Book Award and the Best Book in Midwestern History Award. She's a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian. Dr. Child was born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota, where she is a member of a committee writing a new constitution for the 12,000-member nation. Dr. Quinn New Lee, who goes by New, is an assistant professor of English in the University of South Florida. New Lee earned her PhD and MA in English literature at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She received her BA at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She specializes in comparative race and settler colonial studies, Asian American literature, Native American indigenous literature, and theories of affect and embodiment. Her book, Unsettled Solidarities, Asian American and Indigenous Cross-Representations in the Americas, is under contract at Temple University Press. This book analyzes Asian and Indigenous counters as they are represented in Asian and Indigenous literatures in the Americas. It traces the intimate architecture of contemporary Asian and Indigenous cross-representations in the Americas as imaginative sites of cross-community entanglements, registering the asymmetries of colonial and racial processes, and gesturing toward the vexed constitution of alliances and solidarities. Dr. Lee has been awarded the McKnight Junior Faculty Fellowship, Development Fellowship, the New Researcher Grant, the Humanities Institute Summer Grant, and the Arts and Sciences Award. Balraj Gill is a doctoral candidate in the American Studies at Harvard University. She works at the intersections of Indigenous studies, settler colonial studies, and imperial histories of the Americas, and carceral studies. Her dissertation, The Politics of Confinement, Indigenous Homelands, Imperial Duress, and Incarceration in the Deep North Borderlands, examines how histories of Indigenous confinement and incarceration broaden our understanding of what scholars have called the age of mass incarceration. It centers the Deep North, a cross-border region that is today the leading incarcerator of Indigenous people in North America. The region is comprised of hundreds of Indigenous homelands in 7 states and provinces: Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. She's currently a fellow at the Newberry Library as part of the Newberry Consortium for American Indian Studies and a Canada Fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. She is also supported by a research grant from the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. She participated in the Harvard and Slavery Research Project and co-authored an essay on Harvard's relationship with slavery for a forthcoming volume titled Slavery in the University, History and Legacies, published by the University of Georgia Press. Dr. Christopher Lehman is the chair of the Ethnic, Gender, and Women's Studies Department at St. Cloud State University in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Lehman holds a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma State University and earned his advanced degree at UMass Amherst, a master's degree in history, and a doctorate in African American studies. He has been a summer visiting fellow at Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research through the National Endowment for the Humanities. His work has been published at the University of Massachusetts, the Minnesota Historical Society, and Oxford University. His 2014 book, Power, Politics, and the Decline of the Civil Rights Movement, A Fragile Coalition, argues factionalism and government sabotage diminished the efforts of 4 major African American organizations in the late 60s and early 70s. His 2011 volume, Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley, 1787 to 1865, documents the persistence of slavery in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin through the end of the Civil War. Although African American slavery was banned in the region in 1787, slaves were held there or here by soldiers and federal officials. His previous books, A Critical History of Soul Train on Television, The Colored Cartoon, Black Representation in American Animated Short Films, and American Animated Cartoons of the Vietnam Era, drew national reviews and media coverage. Professor Gordon Nakagawa is Emeritus Professor of Communication Studies and Asian American Studies at California State University, Northridge. His scholarship has examined Japanese-American World War II incarceration narratives and communication, power, and equity in marginalized communities. During the 1980s, he was an activist with the National Coalition for Redress Reparations, which advocated for a formal apology and reparations from the federal government during World War II, from the federal government for 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in U.S. concentration camps during World War II. He is a founding faculty member of the Asian American Studies Department at California State University, Northridge, and the founding chair of the Asian Pacific American Communication Studies Division in the National Communication Association. He has also served as the Director of Equity and Diversity and the first Director of Diversity Integration at Hamline University. He is currently an organizational consultant on communication, equity, and social justice, and most recently, he was Vice President for Diversity, Integration, and Organizational Design at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. He is presently a member of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League and a board member of Full Circle Theater. So with that, let me invite our first speaker.